Free speech is one of those ideas that seems simple until you actually look at it closely. At first glance, it feels obvious. People should be able to say what they think without fear of punishment. But when you start digging into the history and the practice, you find something much more complex. A story of centuries of trial and error, of societies discovering both the power of free expression and its real-world limitations. The roots go back to ancient Athens, where citizens prized the right to speak openly in the assembly. But even then, speech wasn't unlimited. Slaves and women weren't granted the same voice, and speaking too freely against the state could still end badly. Later, during the Enlightenment, figures like John Milton, John Locke, and Voltaire expanded the idea, insisting that truth needed the friction of open debate to survive. These ideas carried forward into revolutions in America and France, where free speech was written into the DNA of modern democracy. Yet almost immediately, questions arose. What happens when words cause real harm, or when speech is used not to enlighten, but to manipulate? Legal systems have struggled with those questions ever since. In the United States, free speech protections are strong, but not absolute. Courts carved out exceptions for things like incitement to violence, obscenity, and libel. You're supposed to not be able to say untrue, mean things about other people, although enforcing that can be very hard or impossible. Other countries, especially in Europe, have been more willing to restrict hate speech, believing that such speech itself undermines equality. And in authoritarian states, of course, the entire concept of free expression is often treated as dangerous by those in power. What we see is that no society has ever embraced speech without limits. There are things you can't say on TV. George Carlin has an entire special about it. But this limit becomes especially clear when you consider what philosopher Karl Popper called the paradox of tolerance. If a society tolerates absolutely everything, even calls for intolerance, then intolerance will grow unchecked like a snowball rolling down a hill until tolerance itself is destroyed. It's a self-defeating loop. Defend the right of people to argue against free speech, and soon no one has free speech. We're seeing this paradox play out in the digital age, where extremist groups exploit liberal protections to spread propaganda, harass opponents, and flood public spaces with disinformation. Left unchecked, that kind of speech doesn't enrich debate, it silences it. So how do we escape the paradox? One way is to reframe free speech, not as an unlimited individual right, but as part of our social contract. Just as societies agree to limits on personal freedom in order to live together, laws against theft or violence, your freedom stops at another person, we also need shared norms around communication. The contract is simple in principle. You can speak and I can speak, and neither of us should try to strip away the other's ability to participate in the conversation. Speech that aims to end the conversation altogether through intimidation, dehumanization, or incitement is not a contribution to dialogue, but an attack on it. When people criticize speech that says something like transgender people shouldn't exist or welcome in public, that is dehumanization, which is saying at the same time that they shouldn't have the right to have their ideas, their speech, and present it. You see what I mean? So once you understand this perspective, you notice this perspective doesn't erase the tension between liberty and restraint, but it clarifies why the tension exists. Free speech works only when everyone has some degree of security and respect in the public sphere. That means drawing careful boundaries, not to shut down disagreement, but to protect disagreement itself. It also means recognizing that law can only go so far. Culture matters. Platforms matter. Education matters. A society resilient to lies and intimidation doesn't just spawn. It has to be built and maintained. The hopeful part is that free speech, like democracy itself, is a living project. It has grown and adapted over centuries, and it can keep adapting. The challenge is to accept that speech is not just an individual liberty, but a collective responsibility. If we want a world where ideas can clash productively, where truth can be tested in the open, then we have to defend the conditions that make that possible. Free speech is strongest when we treat it not as a weapon to wield against others, but as a shared promise to keep the conversation alive. alive. I'm Ryan, this is Ryan Koff World Takeover. Click the next video to see a little more.